To the LaRouche Pack class series on what is the new paradigm. I'm Benjamin Dennison with LaRouche Pack. I'm joined today by Dennis Small with Executive Intelligence Review. This is our third class in our new 2018 class series on the subject of what's needed to create this new historical paradigm that we're now really on the verge of potentially creating. And as our viewers are aware, those of you who have participated so far, we're getting into the real underlying critical, philosophical, scientific, in-depth ideas underlying this historical, strategic, really humanitarian shift that we're trying to create right now. And so today we're happy to continue this class series with the next presentation following off of last week, where we had an excellent discussion of the history and the emergence of what people now call, quote unquote, geopolitics as a strategic policy coming out of the British Empire's attempt to maintain their control of the world. And today we're going to take on that issue, but now from a different and I would say deeper angle, going at the philosophical ideas underlying that political outlook, something that Mr. LaRouche has spent much of his life studying and elaborating and presenting in many of his works. So we're going to get to Dennis in just a second. If you're new to us, I want to remind all of our live viewers, those of you we're happy to have join us live as we're broadcasting this tonight. This is an open dialogue and discussion. The point of this class series is to educate you and to help you, the viewers, become leaders and capable actors right now at this current situation. So the whole point is to engage in discussion, question, and answer. Dennis provided an excellent selection of reading material to go along with this class. We'll be getting into some of the substance on that, and we want your questions live. So you can either email us at classes@larouchepack.com, or you can comment on the class series webpage. And just a reminder, if you haven't registered, you're missing out on all the good stuff. So register so you can get the email updates, you can get the homework assignments, which is a very productive way to test your understanding and help engage in further dialogue outside of the classes with Dennis, Harley, myself, and others. You can go to lpac.co/NP2018 to register. So again, if you haven't registered, please do so. You also get access to the follow-up classes every other week, which is something you just won't get access to unless you're registered. So with that, I think, and I'm sorry, and obviously we have two remote audiences joining us today. I apologize. We have Houston, Texas. We're happy to be joined by Houston again. So we have a remote live studio audience down in Houston joining us today. So hello to all of you. We're glad to have you there. And we have a second remote audience hooked in from Detroit, Michigan. So hello to Detroit. So we're happy to continue our process of really a national and international engagement and dialogue and discussion. So with those points noted, I'm just going to turn it over to Dennis, and we'll get into the depth of the discussion today.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ben. The topic that I want to discuss with you tonight is, are you human or Humean? The philosophical underbelly of geopolitics. In other words, that point upon which an attack can succeed in actually defeating it. And I want to, even before I jump right into the material, mention to people what you may well be aware of, which is that the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, delivered his State of the Union address a couple of days ago, which is of extraordinary importance. I'm not going to even attempt to give you a briefing or a report on that. You probably have seen some of the press accounts which refer to the new weapon systems and so on, which they have developed, which essentially make the entire ballistic missile defense system that has been under development in the United States for decades completely obsolete. But equally significant is the way that President Putin began his remarks, which was with a discussion of the crucial importance of creativity and technological advance to make the life of the population better. And it is unleashing of that capability, he said, which has in fact made these breakthroughs in the military and the scientific military sphere possible. And he directly stated from the outset that the principal task facing Russia at this point is to eliminate poverty. Now, any recollection that might give you of a discussion which has been going on in China, I think, is very much to the point. There is no question that China and Russia are working together jointly in a number of different areas. And in point of fact, the developments going on from both of those fronts of the same issue do lay the basis for finishing off geopolitics once and for all. The other aspect related to geopolitics and what we'll be discussing tonight is the simple fact that this happened right under the noses, so to speak, of U.S. intelligence. We've been Sputnik'd again. And that happens when your entire approach to the world and politics is based on empiricism and self-certainty, sense certainty, which is one of the issues we'll be taking up here. And the opposite approach is what has actually allowed for the Russians to make their breakthroughs and their advances. So this is extremely germane. And let me just also state, to make sure that we keep our theme well in sight, that the issue is not simply to end geopolitics in 2018, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche has stated as the strategic requirement for this year, but we also have to have a new paradigm. The two go hand in hand, as we'll be seeing in our discussion of the philosophical underbelly of geopolitics. Now, my starting point for tonight is to tell you, which some of you may well be aware, that when Lyndon LaRouche and some of his co-thinkers were indicted and then condemned and jailed in 1988 and 1989, the actual principal accusation against Lyndon LaRouche, as he himself said through his lawyer at the trial, was that he was an authoritarian personality. This is exactly the issue which Helga raised in the first of the three classes which we've had so far. And by authoritarian personality is meant, according to the British, that knowable truths exist. They deny that knowable truths exist. They deny the existence of universal principles, and anyone who claims that they do, and furthermore that they are achievable by man, is someone who they consider to be extremely dangerous. And LaRouche's views in this regard flew and fly totally in the face of the Frankfurt School, of the kind of hedonism and empiricism which we'll be looking at tonight. In fact, flies totally in the face of British geopolitics. And ultimately, that is why Lyndon LaRouche was jailed, because his ideas were and are and will be dangerous to this British order. Just as Socrates' ideas were dangerous, and he, of course, was also given the similar treatment as LaRouche, because he was considered an authoritarian personality, and he dared to educate the youth on this idea that there are universal principles that are knowable to man's mind. Now, very shortly after Lyndon LaRouche got out of jail, after being in jail, in the most unjust conviction of decades, if not the century in the United States, very shortly thereafter, on July 28, 1994, Lyndon LaRouche wrote a masterpiece article, which was called How Bertrand Russell Became an Evil Man. And therein, Lyndon LaRouche described Bertrand Russell as the most evil man of the 20th century. And there's a very good reason for that. Bertrand Russell openly advocated nuclear war against the Soviet Union, at least up until the Soviets developed nuclear weapons of their own, which threatened the United States in return, and the British as well. He was asked in a TV interview, is it true that you actually called for the nuclear annihilation of the Soviet Union? And he said, oh, sure, no regrets. Sort of like George Soros, subsequently on a different topic, a similar topic. And then there is what Bertrand Russell had to say about encouraging a Black Death. And this is a statement of his from 1953, from The Impact of Science on Society. He said, war has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, i.e. population reduction. But perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. If a Black Death would spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be somewhat unpleasant, but what of it? Really high-minded people are indifferent to happiness, especially other people's. Now, as atrocious as it is to call for nuclear war with the Soviet Union, as atrocious as it is to call for wiping out the better part of the human population through a Black Death, that is not Bertrand Russell's worst crime. His worst crime was to spread widely the satanic disease of British radical empiricism, which is an outlook, as we will see, which totally denies the existence of human creativity. It says that man and the beast are essentially the same, that all knowledge is based on sense perception and nothing but sense perception, and that the proper outlook for society, which is consistent with that fundamental philosophical outlook, is one of geopolitics. Bertrand Russell effectively argued that what we must do is replace physics with mathematics. And this was a total attack on Riemann, in point of fact, by name. So just as many of you have probably read Riemann for anti-dummies, Bertrand Russell is anti-Riemann for dummies. Now, Russell's views come directly from Jeremy Bentham, from Jean Maria Ortiz before that, and from David Hume, especially the radical David Hume towards the end of his life. And in fact, Lyndon LaRouche is really quite emphatic about the significance and importance of this. And here's what Lyndon LaRouche said in this piece which I mentioned to you, How Bertrand Russell Became an Evil Man. LaRouche said, the issue of Kant's break with Hume defines the singularity separating the old empiricism of Locke from the British philosophical radicalism of Shelburne's lackeys and of the Huxley family and Russell later. Understand this, and you understand Russell. Understand Russell in that way, and you begin to understand the past 600 years of European and world history. Then you begin to understand the important features of the now fading present 20th century. Now, in this piece of LaRouche's, he further goes on to explain that this development of British philosophical radicalism, especially this interesting shift which occurs with Hume, which I'll point to a little bit ahead, is that the Venetian game masters behind this whole thing had three principal objectives in mind. They had three strategic tasks. Number one, they had to eliminate the role of France as a crucial power in the world opposed, in effect, to the British Empire at that point. Secondly, says LaRouche, they had to defame and destroy the influence of Gottfried Leibniz. And third, they were out to crush permanently the aspirations to political autonomy and economic development among the English colonies in North America. So their objectives then are stop France, destroy Leibniz, and wipe out what was becoming the American Revolution, and when it became that, still try to wipe it out. So what we're looking at here in LaRouche's formulation of the issues which I'm taking up with you today is an underlying concept of what history actually is. I mean, think for a second, what does it mean for him to say, if you understand British philosophical radicalism and the fact that Russell comes directly from the tradition of Bentham and Hume and Huxley and so on, and then you will understand the last 600 years of history, that should be received as quite a shocking statement. I certainly found it quite shocking. I mean, that's quite a bit for 600 years. But the point is fundamental. And this has been the essence of Lyndon LaRouche's life work, which is that ideas shape history. And in fact, only ideas shape history. The rest are details put into motion by ideas. And the battlefield, the true battlefield, in which we can both defeat British geopolitics and also establish a new paradigm is the battlefield of the mind. And in fact, as I think you will discover over the course of the next few minutes, the battlefield is in your mind as well, because we have all been brainwashed, and I think that's a scientific term, to think like Russell, to think like Hume, to think like Bentham, to think that the world is basically nothing but a war of one against all, of all against all, and it's devil take the hindmost. You got to look out for numero uno, right? And that's the essence of geopolitics. Now, the only way in which we will actually defeat geopolitics is when the hypotheses that underlie it are in fact defeated. And like I said, Lyndon LaRouche's entire life work was premised around this idea. And just to quote him again from this same document, he said that British radical empiricism is a rejection of the idea of any scientifically knowable distinction between man and the beasts. All liberalism rejects the existence of intelligible truth on the same philosophical premises. So it's not a minor matter. If you've ever had trouble organizing people to have an actual understanding of Xi Jinping's concept of win-win and what the Chinese are doing, you might have started to suspect that the problem is not so much a lack of information that you're providing to people, because yes, they do need information. They do need to know what is actually going on in China. They need to know about the 700 million people pulled out of poverty. But it is not simply a problem of information. The difficulty that people actually have is that they cannot, in fact, conceive of what win-win really means. They can't conceive of the world functioning in any way other than a zero-sum game, where if somebody wins, somebody else loses, and it all comes out in the wash. And you know that that's what they think. They may not have even ever heard the word zero-sum game or run across win-win, or never had the misfortune of studying philosophy at the university, or had the misfortune, perhaps even greater, of having studied economics at the university. But that's how they tend to think. And the way you know that is when you tell them, look, what the Chinese are talking about is a totally different approach. It's this idea of win-win. The response that you get is, yeah. But come on, really? And we've all run into that problem. And that's what we're dealing with. Now, for that reason, let's turn our attention to David Hume. David Hume was born in 1711, and he died in the year 1776. Maybe the American Revolution killed him, or the Declaration of Independence. It very well might have. And I've located in the table, which you can see on the screen now, the school of British radical empiricism in general, its development out of the early philosophy of Hobbes and then Locke, which is a different approach, as we'll get to in a moment, as LaRouche was talking about, than that of Hume. And Hume's students, Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham, the Bentham of hedonism, of the philosophical calculus, and of Malthus afterwards. Hume's entire approach, his mission statement, was to essentially apply Newton and Newton's approach to physics to the mind, and then later to the subject of morality. And that's where the crucial switch comes. Newton was 1643 to 1727. Now we're going to be mentioning three works of Hume, so I'll be quoting from him, and you'll see that on the screen in a moment, and some of these selections were also included in the recommended readings. I say recommended in a qualified way. I recommended the way poison is sometimes recommended. It's important to develop a resistance to it by knowing what it is. You need to know your enemy, out there and in here as well. So we're going to look at David Hume's 1738 Treatise on Human Nature, his 1748 Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and his 1751 Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. Now, Hume's basic approach is that all knowledge is based on and actually limited to sense perception. And what he elaborates in painful detail is that if that is your view, you develop utter skepticism. You can't really know anything if you start from the premise that what you know is what you see. And I'm going to read you a quote of Hume's from the Treatise of Human Nature, which gives this idea in summary. He says, "Every distinct perception which enters into the composition of the mind is a distinct existence and is different and distinguishable and separable from every other perception. The understanding never observes any real connection among objects, and that even the union of cause and effect, when strictly examined, resolves itself into a customary association of ideas. Identity is nothing really belonging to these different perceptions and uniting them together. So the only thing you know is what you perceive. So, for example, let's take a for instance. There we go. What do you see? I'll bet you anything you see 3 asterisks, red asterisks, although we'll get to that in a minute, on the screen. So one of the questions here is, well, okay, what is that? Those are 3 observation points that we've located here. And the question is, if we took more observation points, what would we find? Would we see this? Well, that would be a circle. Or those same 3 observation points could be produced by an ellipse. Or maybe those same 3 observation points is produced by a drunk driver. So which is it? A, B, or C, or none of the above? Do you have any way of knowing? Well, you don't really have a way of knowing by just looking at the 3 dots. And the interesting thing here is that if you took 5 points of observation, or 10, or 50, or 100, you still wouldn't know what it was. All you would have would be an endless number, perhaps an infinite number if you had the patience to do it, of particular dots which you were perceiving and which you were observing. I mean, this is sort of the reverse, or the inverse, if you want, of Cousé's discussion of squaring the circle, right? There's no idea whatsoever of the universal principle behind this. Now, okay, you don't have to look at the drunk driver anymore. Let's take another example of this. Starting from the standpoint of Hume, that all that you know is what you perceive or must begin with what you perceive, I ask you the following question. I hope you can see this on camera. Let's see, how's that? Okay, what is this? Let me actually put it over my other lapel. Well, you might say, somebody might say, that's probably a red felt tip pen, a flare pen, or something red that looks like a pen. Well, how do you know that? If you are based on self-perception, how do you know? Is there anything whatsoever that justifies saying that that is a pen, let alone a red pen? For starters, how do you distinguish between the red sense impressions? There's probably somewhere between 1 kajillion and 2 kajillion of those little sense impressions on your eye, depending. And the background, my gray suit. How do you know? What allows you to justify saying that this is an object? Where does the foreground begin and end, and what about the background? Where does it begin and end? Well, there's clearly no way of saying that, not in a rigorously justified way, if we start from the standpoint of self-perception in this whole thing. And that's all that we allow in the form of an argument about knowledge. Then you can get even more skeptical if you like, which Hume ultimately does, by saying, well, how do you know it's red? I mean, what's red? You know, what's red to me is not going to be the same thing as red to Ben. I mean, we may call it the same thing, right? I mean, you and I could agree. We could probably both look at this, and even if we weren't on camera here, we could probably say, well, okay, this is red. But how do we know that what I really, really, really see as red is the same thing you really, really, really see as red? Maybe you see something completely different, and we have different names for it. So there's something going on here which leads us to a fundamental skepticism. You may
And this
also...
is a line of argument that Hume himself developed and put forward?
Well, minus the pen.
Minus
Yes.
the pen.
But yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's in fact implicit in the first quote, but I'm going to give you another couple of quotes to see how far this skepticism takes you, which is really far out. Or there's another argument. This goes way back. I mean, Hume did not discover this kind of asinine thinking. I mean, this goes all the way back to Aristotle and before that. People may recall the famous question of Heraclitus, right, who says, although much more intelligently, you can't step in the same river twice. Well, that's obviously true in one way, because if you step in it a half second later, everything has changed, not just something. Everything has changed. The water has changed, the pebbles have changed, the wind has changed. How can you, what in the world gives you the right to say that's a river? Well, you can't, according to Hume. No unity is actually possible. And this is what he says here is really bad. So listen. In order to justify to ourselves this absurdity, the notion of identity, we often feign some new and unintelligible principle that connects the objects together. Thus we feign the continued existence of the perceptions of our senses, to remove the interruption, and run into the notion of a soul and self and substance to disguise the variation. So there are no objects, there is no unity, and that's exactly, you asked, does Hume carry out this line of reasoning? Yes, he does.
So by identity there, he's saying something underlying any particular individual sense impression.
Even any individual object, to say anything other than I have somewhere between 1 and 2 kajillion little red dots or pixels, right, on the back of my, going into my optic nerve. Anything other than that is unjustified. To say this is an object, any object, is totally unjustified. You can't say that if you start from the standpoint of sense certainty. So there's no unity possible, no objects, no anything. And in fact, it gets worse. That's bad, but it gets worse. He also says there's actually no such thing as a thought. He says, quote, all our ideas are nothing but copies of our impressions, or, in other words, that it is impossible for us to think of anything which we have not antecedently felt, either by our external or internal sense. Now, if you think that's starting to border on the pornographic about what you've antecedently felt, and if you haven't, you don't know it, you're right. I mean, there is a direct line, actually, from this type of radical empiricism to that. So this is really pretty bad. There's no such thing as a thought, and there's absolutely no such thing as cause and effect. You can't conceivably justify that something causes something else to occur. You will find, especially if you take a look at the homework, that Bertrand Russell famously argued that you cannot, in fact, argue that you know that the sun will rise tomorrow. All you know is that it has, in the past, as far back as you can recall or heard about, and that since it's happened a whole lot of times, there's a good probability that it will happen again, but you don't know it. So there's no cause and effect. The very discussion of cause and effect is a red herring and should be excluded from actual science, according to these guys. You know, it's the famous joke, some of you may have heard this, of the cartoon of this scientist who comes running out of his laboratory shouting, they're studying, you know, how to make a better mousetrap, of course, every real scientist studies that. So he comes running out of the laboratory, hollering at the top of his lungs, Eureka, Eureka, we've got it. And his colleague says to him, what do we know? What have we found out? I have proved that cheese kills mice. Now, It's a bad joke, forgive me, but it shows that there is a difference between correlation and causality, which is something that Bertrand Russell didn't know existed, and certainly not Hume. But lest you think that these guys, any of them, were actually original thinkers, no. Let's listen to what Aristotle had to say back in 350 BC. Aristotle, in a work of his which is humorously called De Anima, which means on the soul, and it's humorous because his whole point is to argue that there isn't one. He says, perceptions are always true. It is intellect that introduces errors. Things are first separate and then conjoined. In all cases, falsity occurs in a conjunction. It is intellect that affects the unity. So everything would be just fine if we would just stick to sense perception and not get involved in any of this stupid intellectual or thinking stuff, says Aristotle. So that whole approach on cause and effect is worse than just the idea of saying that no unity or objects can exist. But it gets worser. And worser here is that Hume actually argues that in all rigor, not only don't objects exist, not only does cause and effect not exist, I don't exist. Identities don't exist. And he says in his Treatise of Human Nature, 1738, self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. But there is no impression constant and invariable. It cannot, therefore, be from any of these impressions, or from any other, that the idea of self is derived. And consequently, there is no such idea. So, you have to say, boy, these skeptics really are going pretty far out. But remember what his premises are. And it's not enough to just say, well, they're false. What is the actual new paradigm? What's the actual proper way to think about this? But that's where this rigorously takes you, to utter skepticism about the existence of himself. It's like existentialists. If they really took their argument seriously, they would basically commit suicide, and that would be the end of the existentialist school of thought, which wouldn't be such a disadvantage, at least in terms of philosophy. Although those existentialists can, of course, be, being human beings, most of them, converted to a better way of thinking. But this is worser. So if you've got bad, you got worse, and you got worser, you probably can imagine that there is something that's the worst in Hume, and there is. And the worst is what Lyndon LaRouche pointed to, which is the point at which Hume goes over completely into radical British empiricism, which is the point where Kant breaks with Hume on this issue, interestingly enough. And that's then the basis for everything that follows with Bentham, Russell, geopolitics, and so on and so forth. And that point is where Hume says, okay, we've had an inquiry concerning human understanding. Now we're going to apply this Newtonian approach to the human mind and how it works or doesn't work. We're now going to apply that to morality. And he, therefore, in 1751, wrote an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, which is also a little humorous like Aristotle because it's anything but. And here's what he says. He says, men are now cured of their passion for hypotheses and systems in natural philosophy. Think for a minute, Newton, right? Hypothesis non fingo. That translates roughly from the Latin as, I don't need any of your cruddy hypotheses. I got the facts, man. So this is what Hume is saying. He says, men are now cured of their passion for hypotheses and systems in natural philosophy and will hearken to no arguments but those which are derived from experience. It is full time they should attempt a like reformation in all moral disquisitions and reject every system of ethics, however subtle or ingenious, which is not founded on fact and observation. Now that's really worst. Because what this does, I mean, this takes you right to the heart of a big philosophical dispute, which I'm only going to mention and identify at this point, which is the whole debate between is versus ought. And anyone who's had the misfortune of taking Philosophy 101 in college knows what I'm talking about. The argument is the following. Well, there's what is, like what your senses tell you. And those are areas of knowledge which are subject to scientific investigation and experimentation. Then you get into the area of ought, which is what you think ought to be. And that's subject to people's differing views. And there's no scientific basis for ought. It's simply a question of cultural relativism. Everyone has their own personal oughts, what they would like to see, that ought to be. And so the area of is and ought are two completely distinct spheres, right? Like Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft, same type of thing. That's the is and ought debate, i.e. the morality is not something which can be scientifically determined. And for that reason, Hume concludes that reason is the slave of passions. So once he's said that, once he's applied Newton's rejection of hypotheses to the more, i.e. thinking, considering the cause of things, once he's applied that to the area of morality, it's all over. Because he's let his hair down, and then you get Bentham. Now, you'll be, I think, relieved to know that I'm not going to talk about Bentham a whole lot. There's not a whole lot that really needs to be said about Bentham. What do you need to know? He wrote something called In Defense of Usury. He wrote something in defense of pederasty. He developed something called the hedonistic calculus, which is basically that everybody goes by pleasure and pain, and if you just add up the different pleasures and subtract the different pains, that's your end result. The philosophic calculus, sort of like the straight geopolitical view, right? The zero-sum game. But the only other thing that's really fundamental that you need to know about Bentham is that his thinking is taken in such high regard in the British Empire that after his death, he was mummified, really, made into a mummy, and every single year he is wheeled out of the glass cage, or I guess it's a cage where he's kept, to preside over the annual meeting of the British Philosophical Society, this mummy. And, you know, don't take my word for it. I don't usually go in for multiple choice questions, but I want you to guess, of these two, which is the real mummy? And yes, that...
They literally wheel him out to preside over their meeting?
Yeah. They've had a little difficulty of late because the students, being students, even though they're wrecked by studying British philosophical radicalism, are into pranks, and they started stealing his head. So, you know, they've got a problem with this thing, although, frankly, I think he looks better without his head. But, yeah, they wheel him out. They really do. They wheel him out. That's Bentham. He is, I was going to say, the granddaddy of British philosophy. He's actually the mummy of British philosophy. And with my apologies, I think that's Lon Chaney on the right, if you want to put that back on the screen again. And just so that you know, that's from The Return of the Mummy, if I'm not mistaken. But just so you know what happens, don't study too much of this, please. Be very careful, because I actually have a picture of someone who got a PhD in Bentham from Harvard, and here he is. So really, be careful. All right, so, I mean, Bentham, you know, it's this whole idea, it's reworked Satan.
And just these are major players in British political thought, ideological thought. These are not just academics tucked away in the corner. Right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I should have mentioned this. Bentham was the first head of British intelligence under Lord Shelburne. And we'll come back to Bentham in a minute, because he was the enemy out to destroy the American Revolution.
Right.
In fact, Aaron Burr, after he assassinated Alexander Hamilton, went not just to London, he went to live in Bentham's house.
Sounds dangerous.
What they did, I don't know, and I don't want to know. But yeah, no,
but that's critical. These are not just, you know, people might think, oh, these are just academics, but, you know, the British political thought, philosophical thought, you know, it's something different than their policy towards the world. But these are key people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In precisely the following way. I mean, here's what Bentham says. Nature has placed mankind under the governance There we go. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality, he will remain subject to it all the while. In other words, there is no such thing as morality. There is no such thing as a higher purpose in life other than maximizing your personal pleasure and minimizing your personal pain. And therefore, the whole approach that is taken is that society is simply, as I mentioned earlier, adding all of these pleasures and pains up. And that's how you get to it. There is no morality possible. I'll read you a quote, which I don't have for you on the screen, but it's pretty straightforward. Bentham says, "What the consequences of an act may be upon the whole can never otherwise be ascertained. It can never be known whether it is beneficial or indifferent or mischievous. In some circumstances, even to kill a man may be a beneficial act. In others, to set food before him may be a pernicious one." So if you think that maybe Wall Street bankers and the IMF are schooled in Bentham, you're right. Even though they never took a course from him, this thinking, as Ben was just indicating, is pervasive. It is the basis on which the British form of society, the zero-sum game, is premised. It's the geopolitical approach. Now, let me just give you a couple of quick examples of this, of how this works, of what a zero-sum game is. And you may have run across this at different points. The whole idea of lifeboat ethics, all right? For example, there's only so much by way of natural resources available on the planet, only so much fresh water, only so much clean air, and we therefore have to choose between using a lot of it now and running out of it sooner, or slowing down, and we'll take a little bit longer before we run out of everything. Or we can reduce population, the way Russell said, and we can wipe out people altogether so that we don't despoil the planet Earth. This is, of course, the thinking, if you want to call it that, behind the entire environmentalist movement, which, of course, was founded by the Nazi Prince Philip and the Nazi Prince Bernhard in the IUCN and the World Wildlife Fund. But lifeboat ethics, the way it's sold in university classrooms, and they brainwash kids in this, and this has been going on for decades. I know, I was there. In economics, in philosophy, in sociology, in psychology, you name it. Here's the example you're given. Okay, you're cast adrift at sea. There's 5 of you in a lifeboat, but the lifeboat is only big enough for 4 people. What do you do? And since most sane students say, hey, wait a minute, that's a crazy example, the professor will then come down really hard and say, answer the question. Don't raise extraneous issues. What do you do? There's 5 of you in the boat, only 4 can make it. What do you do? And then once students accept that premise, it's all over, because it debases their morality under the guise of science. My view of that example of lifeboat ethics is very simple. It's a very, very good lesson for any time you happen to be caught in the ocean in a lifeboat that will hold 4 and there's 5 of you. That's what it's good for. And absolutely nothing else. And that's the problem with this kind of thinking, is that they try to generalize it and say that's the human condition. Another perfect example of a zero-sum game, anyone ever played musical chairs? That's a zero-sum game. Want another zero-sum game? How about boxing? Anyone ever remember what Mike Tyson did to his opponent in one boxing match? He bit a piece of his ear off. Really? That's the bestial outlook. And people that I was residing with at the time cheered and thought that was really wonderful. I'll give you another good example of a zero-sum game. A bullfight. Okay. And in fact, what's really behind this, the problem here of this whole outlook we can see where this leads in the recent Florida shooting, and which is only one of most recent of a horrific string of things, which Lyndon LaRouche addressed way back after Columbine in 1999. And we've put this quote out before, but I want to repeat it because it begins to pose the opposite way of thinking about things. Because LaRouche said, look, how does this happen? He says, how does one corrupt innocent children into becoming psychotic-like killers? The quick answer to that question is dehumanize the image of man. It is no oversimplification to say that once that first step, dehumanizing the image of man, is accomplished, the axiomatic basis has been established to make war and killing merely a childish game. And that's the connection between this philosophical discussion, the culture of death in the United States, British geopolitical wars, and the confrontation that it leads into, like what we're seeing right now with this very important Putin speech, and what has to be done to create an alternative to this. Which brings me to the antidote. I promised that there would be an antidote to this poison, and there is. We are not stuck with sense perception being the basis or the starting point even of all knowledge. There's an entirely different approach. And what I want to do is I want to show you, for starters, the quote of someone who once visited Bentham in his home in England and came out to write about Bentham's view of pleasure and pain. And here's what that person said. Nope. There we go. The person who said this was the 6th President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, in 1817. And he spoke about his conversation with Bentham. He said, I said that the evidence of intellect in the operations of the material world were as decisive to my mind as those of the existence of matter itself. Intellect not residing in matter, but molding and controlling it. What is that intellect, and where is it? Everywhere in its effects, nowhere perceptible to the senses. That it modifies and governs the physical world is apparent both to my senses and my reason. Now, what John Quincy Adams said, as a true representative of the Leibnizian outlook which shaped the American Revolution, was in fact developed in great depth by Leibniz and by Nicholas of Cusa as well, who I want to turn to for this part of the discussion because he addresses this question very directly on the question of sense perception. He starts off and this is from a document of his which I recommend that everybody read. It's called The Layman About Mind. It's a dialogue that he wrote in 1450. And he says the following. Aristotle says that to understand is an accident. Parenthetically, recall what we just saw about Aristotle saying that. Aristotle says that to understand is an accident. But something is present to mental intuition, i.e. to reason, which was not present to sense. Mind is a living measure which achieves its own capacity by measuring other things. Mind is not of the nature of changeable things, which it grasps by sense perception, but of unchangeable things, which it discovers in itself. So, okay, what Cusa has just done here is he's, even before they uttered a word, destroyed the entire school of British radical empiricism, or even non-radical British empiricism, because he threw out the entire premise of their argument, which is that what you know is what you perceive, and that all knowledge is built on sense perception. Whereas actually the opposite is true, says Cusa. What you perceive is built on what you know. And you have to start that way if you want to actually know anything. And what Cusa goes on to discuss is that this kind of what he calls mental intuition is something which is greater than and more important than the senses. And he says this is what is actually called the human soul. The mind or the soul, because For Cusa, it's the same thing. A creative mind and a soul or a spirit is the same thing. He says, this is also from the Layman About Mind. He says, something is present to mental intuition which was not present to sense nor to reason, namely the exemplary and incommunicable truth of the forms, he's talking about Plato's forms here, can get to that later, which are reflected in sensible things. Mind is a living substance. Its function in this body is to give it life, and because of this, it is called soul. I'm going to repeat that sentence, basically because I really like it. Its function in this body is to give it life, and because of this, it is called soul. That's what the mind is, the creative mind. Now, then he elaborates this further, and he discusses what I've put up diagrammatically here, which you'll see on the screen, which I'd like you to look at as I read you a quote of Cusa's, which discusses this. I mean, what he says, as you might get the clear sense from looking at this, is that the senses are the lowest form of human mental activity, and actually true knowledge proceeds from above, hierarchically and not below. So what he presents here is the idea that each of these levels are organized in a certain hierarchy, but they're also incommensurable, one between the other. You cannot use the metric applied to senses to even begin to understand rationality, nor that to understand intelligence, nor that to understand God. And let me read you what Cusa says as you look at this diagram. Cusa says, and this is from On Conjectures, he says, there is nothing sensible unless the unity of senses exist. So long, David Hume. There's nothing sensible unless the unity of senses exist. The senses perceive and do not distinguish. Every distinction is indeed from rationality. So rationality makes use of the senses as an instrument in order to distinguish the sensible. But it is rationality itself which in the senses distinguishes the sensible. And then he continues. If rationality investigates intelligence, which it comprehends with no sensible signs, how could it begin this investigation if the light of intelligence did not incite its illumination? Intelligence is therefore related to rationality. Okay, listen carefully here. Intelligence is related to rationality as God himself is to intelligence. Substitute creativity for intelligence and you'll get the right idea. Cusa goes on, intelligence is therefore nothing of that which can be said or named, but rather is the origin of the rational concepts of everything, just as God is the origin of intelligence. So this gives you some idea of the way Cusa approaches this issue of what actual knowledge is. Of course, you do make use of sense perception, but you don't start from sense perception, and it is certainly not self-evidently true. The only thing that allows you to even have a sense perception of anything is the higher functions of mind. And any form of argument that seeks to reduce mental activity to nothing but sense perception, to shatter it and bring it down to that, is reducing us to the level of bestiality. And in fact, I would argue that that's one of the most damaging things that drugs actually do. That's what they're intended to do, is precisely that, to destroy the higher cognitive functions and to leave nothing but a complete kaleidoscope of perceptions. Now, let's turn briefly to Leibniz and get his thinking on this. Leibniz points directly to the issue of the difference between man and the beast. And I'm first going to quote to you from the Monadology, written in 1714, towards the end of his life. I believe Leibniz died in 1716, if I'm not mistaken. And here's what Leibniz writes in the Monadology. And I'm going to read you a slightly fuller quote than what you see on the screen because the intervening parts didn't fit on the screen, but I think they're really important. He says, men act like animals insofar as the succession of their perceptions is brought about by the principle of memory. Then this part isn't on the screen. In this, they resemble medical empiricists whose practice is not backed by theory. In fact, We are mere empiricists in 3/4 of all our actions. If you expect, for instance, that the sun will rise tomorrow because up to now it has always happened, you act as an empiricist. The astronomer alone judges by reason. You see why I wanted to read that. Then he continues, and this is on the screen. Knowledge of necessary and eternal truths, however, distinguishes us from mere animals and grants us reason and the sciences, elevating us to the knowledge of ourselves and of God. Spirits, meaning souls, human souls, are capable of knowing the system of the universe and of imitating some of it by architectonic specimens, each spirit being like a small deity in his field. So for Leibniz, man is not God, but he is capable of creative reason of the sort God has endowed him with, and as God displays in the development of the universe. So for Leibniz, man is creative, as for Cousa as well. That creativity, and only that creativity, is what grants man free will. In other words, man is capable of doing something or not doing something, or of doing A or B. There is free will. And that's the same thing as creativity, I think should be fairly evident. But that's also the source of morality. So creativity, free will, and morality are in fact the same scientific concept. For that reason, Leibniz says that what the purpose of our life is, since we are endowed with that creative capability, is to have what he actually calls happiness, to develop the pursuit of happiness. He doesn't say life, liberty, and the pursuit of pleasure. He doesn't say life, liberty, and the avoidance of pain. He says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which he otherwise sometimes calls felicity. So this is the exact opposite of Bentham's idea of pleasure. It's as opposite as Satan is from God. And here's Leibniz's discussion of felicity. He said, felicity is a lasting state of pleasure. One must shun the pleasures of the sense as one shuns a stranger, or sooner, a flattering enemy. Knowledge is of two kinds, that of facts and that of reasons. That of facts is perception. That of reasons is intelligence. The pleasures of the sense which most closely approach pleasures of the mind and are the most pure and the most certain are that of music and that of symmetry, as will be discussed fulsomely in upcoming classes. So for Leibniz, in other words, morality and science are one and the same thing because they come from the same source, man's creativity. What you know is your own mental creative activity. You don't know objects. You certainly don't know senses. What you know is your ability to create, innovate, and advance society as a whole. And you know your mind's activity based on that kind of creative product which you produce in the world. So for Leibniz, morality and science, like I say, is exactly the same thing. Why? Because man alone creates his own future. For Leibniz, there is no distinction between is and ought, the way people say. In fact, for Leibniz, ought, that is to say, acting on the basis of morality to create a future which is different from what is the most essential characteristic of human nature. And I would like to show you a quote about this, and I'm putting it up intentionally without the name of the person who said it, because as I read it to you, or you read it to yourselves, I would like you to begin thinking who said this. It was not LaRouche. That's all I'll tell you for starters. This person said, "I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. That was part of the speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. upon receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. So, what characterizes us as human beings is this quality of creativity, which is the source of morality and the source of free will. And it is that creativity deployed into the area of economic advance, scientific, technological, economic advance, which has made of our species the only species capable of shaping not only our own future, but the future of the entire universe. I think it's safe to say that Lyndon LaRouche's entire life work is premised on this concept and of his abiding hatred of the bestial, satanic concept of radical British empiricism. And I would like to leave you to hear the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche on exactly this subject matter.
The other part of this thing is we rely, this is going to get you a little more upset, but that's all right, it's good for you. You like challenges. The greatest problem we have today is a misunderstanding of the nature of the human mind. We think of the human mind, most people think of it, they'll tell you that automatically. They'll say that we have a nervous system. We have sense perceptual powers. And what we know of the universe is we know sense perceptual powers. And some people will say foolishly, that's all we know. Only what we know as products of sense perception. And foolish people believe that. Smarter people know there's something else going on, which I specialize in. So therefore, we don't understand human creativity, we don't understand the human identity, because we assume that our sense perceptual powers are the human mind. And the sensual perceptual powers are not the human mind. The human mind is a higher form of existence. And we can demonstrate that in all kinds of ways. One of the best examples, and it always occurs in the areas of creativity. Where do you find the expression of this kind of creativity? Beyond the idea of sense perception. What is beyond sense perception? What is creativity beyond sense perception? Does it exist anywhere else as witting creativity? It doesn't. Only human beings. We don't know of anything else that does that. No other animal has willful creativity. The universe is creative. The processes in it are creative. They change. They evolve to higher states, from lower states to higher states. Not surprising. But only man can willfully create a higher physical state in the universe. And on what do we rely for that? We rely on what we call classical artistic composition. The creativity is bringing into being what you didn't know existed before. And you examine the cases which this occurs, and you study mankind on this standpoint. The most important thing about studying is studying mankind. Because in the history of mankind, we find creativity, the willful creativity, which creates states of nature. We find that, as in the case of Einstein, for example, and minds of that type in physical science. They create the idea of new states of nature that were not previously known. And the idea of how to handle those new states of nature, to understand them, which to us didn't exist before then. This is what mankind does. And therefore, the intellect, the human mind, is not located in sense perception. As a matter of fact, one of the great foolishness is of trying to interpret the human mind as such as being a product of the accumulation of sense perception. It's not. There are many, many kinds of manifestations of that. So the point is we have to be proactive in terms of the concept of human creativity, voluntary creativity by human beings, as typified by classical artistic composition, as actually the typification of this human discovery. And since we are human beings and we have this capability, which no form of animal life does, shouldn't we make this capability our essential profession? Why should we object to having to be creative? Since it's our natural condition, maybe our unhappiness would be less if we spent more time on creativity and less on certain other lower forms of diversions. And that's the answer.
I think that summed things up pretty well. I
so.
think I have a sense where you drew your inspiration from for some of your class and your work here.
You think?
You can't know anything, right?
No.
You can't actually know. We definitely have a number of questions that have come in. I believe Detroit has a question, so we'll get them ready in a second. I'd like to pose one we got coming from some of the internet discussion real quick. But for you watching live now, again, email us, classes@LaRouchepack.com. Send in your questions, your thoughts, your disagreements. If you got your doctorate studying David Hume and you adamantly disagree, then, I'd like to hear your thoughts, and maybe you have some apologies for you. We'd also like to thank people that have donated actually to help these classes. We've gotten a number of people sending in contributions, and as people aware of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, we greatly appreciate and are supported by your contributions. So everybody that's donated specifically for this class series, we'd like to definitely thank you. And anybody who hasn't and is able to, you can donate right on our class series webpage, and that's definitely helps us make these things happen. So with that, I just want to follow up one, just off of the clip from Lynn there, Dennis. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, I think taking up this whole discussion about the nature of knowledge, what do you know, what don't you know, how can you know something? It seems like Mr. LaRouche's work itself is a fundamental contribution to that whole discussion. And, reflecting some of what we just investigated and studied in the last class series when we got really into his economics work. His metric of potential relative population density is a scientifically rigorous, definite, clear measurement of when mankind has increased his truthful relation to the universe, allowing mankind to have a higher level of potential population and living standard compared to a previous state. And isn't that itself a rigorous demonstration of having actual truthful universal knowledge versus not having it? I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, Linda LaRouche wrote a piece called LaRouche's Discovery, where he focused on his discovery, what his fundamental breakthrough is. And the opening paragraph or sentence of that, I can't quote it exactly from memory, but the concept is very straightforward. He said that his discovery is he had unearthed or discovered the causal, measurable relationship between fundamental advances in scientific thought, in discovery of universal physical principles of the universe, the causal relationship between that and the measurable impact of that on potential relative population density. Exactly that. In other words, there is no external metric to man of what is true and what is not true. There is no outside standard. It's not just that sense perception and the skepticism that leads to is false. There actually is any external metric, as Cusa implies and as LaRouche develops in great depth, other than man's own creativity, because the fundamental, if what you are understanding is the causes which produce effects, if what interests you is not simply the effects, the dots that may or may not move around on the screen, or the effects that you see in different areas of the world. If what you're interested in is to know the actual things that cause that, or the ideas or the breakthroughs that cause that, then it is actually the case that man's creative activity is the most fundamental physical law of the universe that we know of so far. So that what you actually know is in fact entirely subjective. And Cusa is emphatic on this, and I would argue this is one of Cusa's great breakthroughs, if not the great breakthrough, which is to demonstrate that science is in fact subjective. Not in the sense of, oh, we all have our own opinion, not that kind of subjective, but subjective in the sense that what you in fact know is your mind's own process of knowledge, i.e. changing the world. So there is no way of separating out our direct active interaction with the physical universe that we're creating. And Lyndon LaRouche's development and the discovery of that, as it pertains in particular to economics, with all of the backdrop behind that, is in fact his most fundamental discovery, as he points out in that paper of his. So I think that, as LaRouche himself says on numerous occasions, his intellectual predecessors include Leibniz, include Cusa, include Riemann, emphatically among others. But it's precisely around this idea that your primary consideration is creative activity, the creative activity of the physical universe, and the creative activity of man's mind in further developing that physical universe. And that's what distinguishes us from all lower species.
Great. Let's get Detroit on here.
Jim, that's all. Can you hear us?
Yeah, we can maybe just speak loudly, but we can hear you.
Okay, this is Jim. I'm going through all of your talk tonight and recalling a lot of things that Lynn wrote about. I find this to be, in general, starting with Aristotle and going through what you said about Hume and down to Bertrand Russell, especially back at the turn of the 1900s, when the attack on education was really brought forward. This really shows that the idea of sense perception has been pushed by the empiricists to actually destroy the mind in this fashion. Once you get to people in any endeavor of education, be it health or science or economics or whatever, people will go in that direction using sense perception more than their own cognitive powers. In my past time when I taught flying, I was a flight instructor for some time, I found that people, no matter what their personalities were, had difficulties in using or developing their cognitive powers. Now, with the education the way it has gone down or been dumbed down to the state it is today, the young people in school, whether it's kindergarten through high school or college, university, it all comes down to me to be an attack on the sense perception to dumb people down so they don't even develop sense perception, let alone cognitive powers. So I find there's nothing humorous about this. It comes out to be Hume or us. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I really agree on this question of education. In fact, in some of the previous discussion around Harley's class, this topic was also touched upon, and I think very usefully so, because there was a discussion of, okay, what's really behind geopolitics? What's the cause here? Is it the media that's pushing it? Is it this? Is it that? And so on. And I think that the that the role of education or miseducation in inculcating in people an axiomatic view, that is to say, underlying assumptions which they don't even question, they don't even know they have them. If they knew they had them, they wouldn't work. They don't even know they have them. They think it's human nature. so that there's an absolute blind spot in their thinking, so that they just sort of naturally, quote unquote, naturally think in an empiricist fashion. And the educational system has absolutely drilled that into people's skulls over and over and over again, among other things, by basically telling them that if you don't think this way, you're not going to advance. The whole system of university education and college degrees and who publishes and who doesn't publish, grants and so on and so forth, is an absolutely devastating form of control over society, at least as important as the mass media. Because what it does is it establishes the dominance of that mummy of Jeremy Bentham being wheeled out and running every single classroom from the universities on down, or I should probably say from the universities on up, because the universities are usually the pits, all across the country. And it's not just in the United States. This is a universal, well, not universal, it's a general problem throughout the transatlantic sector, certainly all over Europe, certainly in Ibero-America, that's the case. There are parts of Russia that have had this problem, especially because of the role of YASA and the Club of Rome in Russia, although they clearly have gotten past important aspects of that to be able to have the kinds of breakthroughs that they have had in fundamental science and physics and the military implications of that. But this educational question is absolutely deadly. And it's something that we have to overcome, not by just, giving people some nice ideas and saying, here, why don't you read this good book or something like that. We have to polemicize against this. You have to combat this. There is no way that people are going to abandon the kinds of ideas on which they have built their entire identity and their career and everything that means, unless they come to see how absolutely absurd and dangerous those ideas are. That's why youth tend to be the people who are more open to actually scientific thinking, which means changing the axioms of how you were thinking about it before, because they have not yet constructed an edifice of lies in their entire life. They're still open to trying to figure out. It's the same reason that people tend to be more open to actually revolutionary ideas like Cusa and Larouche and Leibniz and so on in periods of massive social upheaval, a mass strike process. Youth is a mass strike process. I mean, that's the period of life which could be called a mass strike process, where you're questioning everything. And I think it's absolutely imperative that our movement, the LaRouche movement, keep as a central focus of its activities this idea of recruitment and organizing of the youth, just like Socrates did. It's what really gets you in trouble. The enemy is not going to go berserk if you talk to congressmen and if you do this and you do that. They figure, okay, they'll have a little success here, a little success there. They'll fail with most of these people because they've already compromised. But you start recruiting a youth movement, and then you're in trouble. And that's exactly what we've got to do. That's what LaRouche did and has done throughout his life, and it's what we have to make sure we continue to do, and that means polemicizing around these kinds of fundamental ideas. There are no ideas too fundamental for discussion. There are no ideas that are too difficult. I mean, the way LaRouche organized and recruited us, both my generation and Ben's generation and the next generations, was not by saying things to us that we understood. I can remember very well listening to LaRouche's first 100 lectures and saying, I didn't understand almost anything, but I know there's something there. He's got an entire vision of a different universe inside his head. And we can make this happen because this is what it's premised on. And you then educate yourself and you educate your emotions to begin to understand what LaRouche is actually talking about. And I think that approach, which has been so successful with Linda LaRouche, is something which we in the LaRouche movement have got to make sure we follow.
Great. Well, I know we have a few more questions just came in online. I know we have at least, I believe, two more in Houston and two more in Detroit and one or two more in Houston, at least so far. So let's go to Houston next, and then we'll go back to Detroit after that, and then we'll go to one of the online questions.
Yeah, hi, Dennis and Ben. I wanted to kind of pose an irony, which is that, as we know, the United States was founded on the idea of the pursuit of happiness. How we've seen in the case of China and Russia, these are people who've gone through tremendous hardship, suffering, in the last century in particular. Now we're seeing a very dramatic change in both China over the last 15, 20 years or so, and particularly this latest development with Russia, which is making certain people in the West very unhappy. I was wondering if you could comment on what we actually need to do to return to this idea of the pursuit of happiness here in the United States.
What you could do is make sure that Jeremy Bentham's mummy remains where it belongs, which is in a crypt somewhere, and that his ideas not have the influence which they clearly do have. No, the point about happiness is important, and getting back to the principles on which the United States was founded is extremely important. The big problem we have is if you went out into a crowd and of 100 people and said to them, do you think we should go back to the principles on which the United States was founded? Well, I was about to say 99 out of 100 would agree with you, but that probably isn't true anymore, because some people would say, no, that was a terrible idea. But bear with me with the argument. The majority would say, oh, yeah, we absolutely should go back to the founding fathers and those principles and so on and so forth. And even assuming, for the purposes of this argument, that most of those people are well-meaning and that what they say is honest and sincere, I can assure you, as I'm sure you know, that the vast majority of those people have no idea of what the United States was actually founded on. They don't know what John Quincy Adams said about Bentham. They don't know what Hamilton's economics actually was. Otherwise, they would see it reflected in China today, and they wouldn't have so much trouble understanding win-win. The problem is that people are not aware. They do not know what the actual basis of the creation of the American Republic was. But interestingly enough, it's something that's there just sort of under the skin. It's something that's in our history. It's in our national history, and it's actually there, and you can awaken it in people. It's there to be found, even though it's been destroyed by decades, really, of pessimism, cultural pessimism, and especially the Frankfurt School idea that there is no such thing as actual truth. So our organizing task, I think, is twofold. One is to actually present the programmatic ideas to solve the crises which we face. For example, I'll give you one example. Go back and read a very short article of Lynn's, and it was published in a recent issue of EIR. I don't have it in front of me now, but it's easy enough to find, which is called the LaRouche Doctrine. And it's a discussion by Lynn, again, I forget the exact year, but it's the 1990s, of what the basis has to be of the relationship between the United States and the then Soviet Union. And in that short piece, it's all there. The World Land Bridge is there. The whole idea of the strategic relationship required between the United States and Russia and China is there. It's all there. So the programmatic basis has to be presented over and over and over again to people. We have to lay out the solutions to the crises, Lynn's 4 laws. But what we also have to do is we have to use those 4 laws, for example, or the crisis that people are facing, to go behind what will be people's tendency to limit it to just the facts. Tell me the facts. Oh, Glass-Steagall, I'm for Glass-Steagall. Although they don't want to have a fight with Wall Street, they would just like to have Glass-Steagall. Or, yeah, I'm for a Hamiltonian system, but they don't understand what's really behind that. We have to go, especially with what LaRouche lays out in the last law, the 4th law, where he discusses the scientific basis or the scientific advances that are necessary for this entire enterprise to actually function. The whole development of space science, which is something which is very close to the heart of Houstonians, or should be, and will be through Keisha's campaign. Or the question of fusion power, the same type of thing. It's not just that people should say, okay, yeah, we need that form of energy because we need that kind of energy. What does that point to in terms of the underlying universal principles about the human mind that people need to understand and to stop thinking the way they're thinking now? Because if they were thinking correctly now, we wouldn't be in the damn mess that we're in. It's a simple proven fact that people are not thinking correctly. So we have to address that. And we have to find the ways of addressing that polemically at the same time or through the process of proposing the programmatic solutions. I mean, one very useful thing is to just have people look into the eyes and souls, or through the eyes into the souls of Chinese today. They're happy. It's not pleasure. It's the happiness that a parent feels at the development of their child. They're happy because they know that the future is going to be better than the present. They're happy because they're exercising their creative powers and making their country and the world a better place to live. And I think that looking at ourselves as Americans in that mirror will hopefully allow us to see ourselves a little more clearly as being the actual heirs of John Quincy Adams' devastating attack on Bentham.
Thanks, Dennis. Let's get back to Detroit. I think Detroit has another question ready for us.
Hear me?
Yeah, just speak loudly.
That was actually a good introduction because I wanted you to see if you could speak about this difference in outlook within the context of, say, Jefferson versus Hamilton. Because, looking at some of what Hamilton writes, it's obvious that he would have agreed with Leibniz. And to set up something like a credit-based system in particular is a huge leap of faith in terms of the human population's ability to actually be creative naturally. So anyway, I thought maybe you could expound upon that because we are dealing with this in organizing, just as you said. You ask people if you want to go back to the founding principles of the United States, and nominally, yes, but if they know a damn about, what either side actually thought, probably not.
I can say a little bit about that, but not a huge amount. I'm really not an expert in this subject. But let me mention two things, and other people in the organization definitely are and can undoubtedly say far more than I can. But let me say two things about this. First of all, one of the fundamental differences that you can see between, say, Jefferson and Hamilton, or Jefferson and John Quincy Adams, or Jefferson and Washington for that matter, is on the slavery question. And this is not a minor issue. This is not the question of, well, those were the times and that's how it was and this, that, and the other. It's not that. It's a question of what's your view of what a human being actually is. And to have an outlook which not only actively defended slavery, but actually pleasured himself with his slaves the way he did, and his active defense of that, gives you an indication of what's going on. But let me mention a second thing, because it's something that I've been thinking about since the discussion period around Harley's class, and I do want to try to provide as much continuity in the discussion process as possible, because this whole class series was designed as a unity, and it's really important that people approach it that way. One of the crucial debates and discussion that went on in the young United States was around the French Revolution. And excuse me, Jefferson was with the French Revolution, to make the point simply. Now, what was the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution? If you study your, basic history courses, they'll say, well, not a whole lot. One group of people spoke English, the other spoke French, or, one group had guillotines and the other didn't, or things like that. But basically, not a huge difference, but there was a fundamental axiomatic difference in terms of what the concept of man was and what the political purpose of it was. Behind the French Revolution as a historical process was Lord Shelburne and Jeremy Bentham, directly. Bentham was the author of many of the actual speeches. I mean, he ghost wrote, got an early start at being a mummy, I guess. He ghost wrote a bunch of the speeches of the great heroes of the French Revolution, Robespierre and so on and so forth. It was all, remote control from London. And that's because the whole outlook involved in that was an anti-scientific outlook, as you know, chopping people's heads off, and being, as with what came out of with Pol Pot and other effluvia of the Sorbonne, this idea that any knowledge is dangerous and is, after all, a reflection of an authoritarian personality. The French Revolution was the mass expression of hatred of the authoritarian personality, i.e. the idea that there's any truth. And it was organized by the British, not accidentally by Bentham, but for the purpose of destroying the American Revolution. Not in the sense of sending gunboats, they did that too, but in the sense of destroying the concept of man behind the American Revolution and saying, oh, it's all the same thing, right? And that's what Jefferson was with. Now, the reason I mention this and also connect it to some of the earlier discussion, there was a question that came up in part of the discussion with Harley over LaRouche's influence in Ibero-America and so on and so forth, which Harley also addressed and elaborated on. But the questioner asked, somewhat not understanding why we were critical of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and said, there's the Kirchners, there's Lopez Portillo, there's this, there's that. Well, what's the story with Hugo Chavez? He's also anti-imperialist. Hugo Chavez is like the French Revolution. His concept of man and his whole political approach was exactly that, straight, Benthamite, and run by the British. Absolutely. Chavez was created by the British, he was organized by the British, and he was right at the point before he became president, he was invited over to London, wined and dined by the British ambassador to Venezuela, who took him to London to make sure that everything was going to go the way they wanted. And Chavez's approach is not the same as Lopez Portillo or the same as the Kirchners or something like that, and certainly not the same as LaRouche's. You don't want to look at this through a romanticist type of approach. Romanticism in the revolution, quote unquote, is not the way you actually evaluate what's going on. Romanticism in the revolution leads you to support the French Revolution without clearly understanding the concept of man behind this. And Hugo Chavez, for example, is on the record supporting as his concept of law the crown jurist of Nazi Germany, explicitly. Because Chavez's argument on this thing, on Schmidt, was, like him, he believes vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the word of God, and I, Hugo Chavez, the supreme leader, represent the people. Therefore, I represent the voice of God. Therefore, you guys are going to do what I say you guys got to do. So wherever you have a French Revolution, as whenever you have this view of man, you always need a dictator, like a Hobbes's Leviathan, to run the show. So the irony here is that they polemicize against the authoritarian personality, which means that there are truths, and in fact organize in favor of real dictatorships to impose their bestial view of man. So that, I think, is the best contribution I can make to this discussion around Jefferson. Others can certainly add much more about this.
All right, we have one question came in from someone online. This is looks to be a new registration, somebody who's new to the class series. Somewhat of a personal question. The questioner asks, what if it seems like we have gone through our entire life and have never, quote unquote, discovered anything actually new? Are we just living on a lower level of sense perception endlessly?
Nothing is endless in human life. You can always change, you can always modify, you can always become better. It just takes hard work. and sometimes more than hard work. It takes an emotional decision, that is to say, a psychological decision, which is I'm going to do it, regardless of the obstacles, regardless of what people throw up in your way, to decide to work at it. And, these things don't come overnight. They come by actually committing yourself to, first of all, studying the great minds to get some idea of how they actually thought. And what I would recommend for especially a person coming around the organization, or even people who have been around a while, is the starting point of your reading syllabus is Lyndon LaRouche. As important as Cusa is, as important as Leibniz is, as important as Plato is, don't start back in 250 BC, really. Start with what LaRouche has to say, because it will give you, and it's not just that he's more modern or writes in English, it's that he will give you an organizing principle, a concept from which you can go back to actually understand what others are talking about. And it may take work, it may take many readings, many rereadings. I don't even want to tell you the number of times I read the Monadology, basically understanding nothing, even though, having read what LaRouche had to say about it. You've got to work at these things. And again, the starting point on all this stuff is what LaRouche has had to say, combined with using your mind to organize and change others. Do not think that knowledge comes from sitting back in the easy chair or the hardback chair, or wearing a hair shirt or anything like that. It's not a question of torturing yourself. It's a question of thinking and using your mind always to educate and change others. Because however little the questioner may think he understands or she understands, or however little creativity he or she feels in his or her life, believe me, the fact that you wrote a question and got on this show and are listening and participating in this discussion, it's not that it puts you ahead of other people, it gives you a responsibility that others don't have or haven't figured out yet. You now have no choice. You're listening to what we're discussing here. You don't have a choice. Yeah, you have a choice, sure. You can say, forget it, I don't want to do that. Pass me the weed. But your actual only choice is to use what knowledge you can develop from previous great thinkers to organize and educate others. This is what an actual creative emotion is all about. It's not something like you just sit in the bathroom and you have some brilliant idea or something like that. Good ideas usually come when you're trying to explain an idea to somebody else. Any teacher will tell you that the most exciting, any good teacher will tell you that the most exciting, enthusiastic thing, emotionally uplifting thing is teaching and communicating an idea to others, because it's not a question of passing on information. It's not a question of saying, read the syllabus or answer the following multiple choices. It's when, by expressing some ideas and using props of different kinds to communicate a concept, you trigger in the mind of the other person the recreation of that concept. You're not passing him data or her data. You're trying to short circuit his earlier way of thinking and to use that to try to trigger that flash, the light bulb that goes off supposedly. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. And whenever you can do that with someone, whether it's organizing on the street, talking with someone on the phone, that is the most exciting creative thing that a human being can do. So no matter what your level of specific knowledge is at any point, all knowledge is active, or it isn't knowledge. All knowledge, as Cusa says very clearly, is you have to use your mind to measure, i.e. to know and to change everything around you. So, bottom line, number one, stay on with these classes and do a lot of reading. Number two, come out and organize with us. Go out onto the streets. Try to change somebody else. It's really hard and it's really exciting. So come on aboard.
can certainly endorse that. So we have questions are definitely coming in here. So we have, I think next we'll go to Houston, and then we'll take an online question that just came in, and then we'll go back to Detroit, and then we'll see where we stand. We have a couple more online questions that have also come in. We'll see if we can cram those in there. But let's just start with Houston online and then back to Detroit. And we have Keisha Rogers here for us. Hi, Keisha.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you for that presentation. And I just wanted to go back to the subject of the youth and the discussion of what's going on in our culture right now, because I think that what you have demonstrated in your presentation, looking at the direct threat to our future that has been designed by people like Bertrand Russell and David Hume, is what we're experiencing today in terms of this culture of death. And when Mr. LaRouche started his youth movement and the educational program around the youth movement, I think that this is exactly what's required right now. But the problem is that there's this need in society that the conditions are, the youth are conditioned to think that if I'm not accepted in society, if I don't go along with popular opinion, then they feel threatened, just as we're seeing in our education system. So we're discussing, how do you get the creative potential of every single young person to be brought out, to make profound discoveries, to actually have a future based on the idea that we are generating a creative society. But I think my question is really centered around the fact that until we actually have a society that recognizes that this culture of death, of degeneracy, of youth not even wanting to go to school, parents being afraid to send their children to school, parents being the children right now with these recent this tragedy that happened, then this perspective of actually allowing for the creative potential of young people to come out is completely destroyed or missing from our society. So I wanted you to address it a little bit more, because I think what Lyndon LaRouche has really developed in terms of getting people to break with the popular culture, the popular opinion, the wanting to be accepted, wanting to go along to get along, is really at the forefront of the fight that we're in the midst of right now. And then that goes to what I've been fighting for with my campaigns, is that the nature of the space program is not just some after effect or something that's supposed to be for a few people, but it really has to transform the way we think about who we are as a species, who we are as a people, as human beings, and how does this help us to develop our identities even at a higher level than what these individuals that you were describing earlier would want to take from people. And you look at what's going on in terms of the culture, the way you are going to combat that is to have a sense of mission, a sense of optimism, or the idea of having a sense of imagination. All of these things have been taken away. Young people are having to grow up too fast right now and are not being given the opportunity to express their truly creative potential because they're living in fear. So I just wanted to put those comments out there and see if you would like to address that.
Yeah, sure. I would like to respond to aspects of that. We have to, in this generation, as with all previous ones, and there are significant generational differences, but the approach to organizing, I think, is the same. It's the same river, even though you step into it at different times. You always have to organize everybody you possibly can, with the understanding that only very, very few people are actually going to respond at first. You're not going to get everyone to respond. And maybe the proportions are lower now than they were in your generation or lower than in my generation. That's probably true because of all the things that you were describing. But the approach to organizing is the same, because what we have to do is to, in organizing and talking to absolutely everybody, find those precious few people who will respond, who will be the actual leaders, who will step outside of the box that they've been put in, who are able to not think along the lines of go along to get along, for example, the phrase that you used. And yeah, that may be harder now than it was in previous generations, and it's important to register that and take that into account. And it absolutely has to do with this culture of death. But the way we reverse that is the way that you always reverse Dark Ages, is with a Renaissance, which does not get the majority of people going. It requires leaders. In the period of the Black Death, in the 14th century in Europe, where the Western civilization, the human species as we knew it in the West at that point, almost wipes itself out. We almost destroyed ourselves at that point. And what saved us was not a mass revolt of thousands and millions of people. It wasn't a French Revolution. It wasn't the romanticized masses. It was a Renaissance created by a very small group of people, a relative handful of extraordinary men and women who thought morally and who thought scientifically and who knew that those two statements were one and the same thing, who did not think it made sense anymore to go along to get along, since that would just leave you to be either a flagellant or to be a hedonist. And either way meant the death of the human species. And that's how Renaissances actually occur. And the same thing applies to today. You know, recently I've had the opportunity, just because I've been driving around a bit, to get some reading done that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. Not that I read while driving, but I'm listening to some audiobooks. And I don't text while driving either, and I wish the rest of you wouldn't do it either. Editorial comment. But so I've been listening to some audiobooks, and one of the ones which I'm listening to right now, which I'm really enjoying immensely and learning from immensely, are the speeches of Martin Luther King. Now, I'd read a number of these in the past, but I'm listening to him deliver his sermons and his speeches and so on. And by the way, if you're wondering where I found that quote of Martin Luther King on receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize, I was listening to an audiobook, and I said, oh my gosh, I need this for the class discussion I'm going to have, because I know I wanted to talk about is and ought. And I was amazed at the depth of understanding and philosophical depth of Martin Luther King. But the point that I want to refer to here is not just a general comment about Martin Luther King, but as I'm sure you know far better than I, Keisha, throughout his entire life, the whole thing is an active polemic against go along to get along. I mean, in just those words, just like Kennedy also in his Profiles in Courage. He was completely opposed to that, to the idea that people just did what other people were doing. He's got these very funny expressions in sermons where he says, well, people are there, of course, believe in the 10 Commandments, and they think they're important and so on. But what they really believe in is the 11th commandment. And that is, thou shalt not get caught. And so he's polemicizing in a very loving way, but really nasty. That's a leader. That's a leader, obviously, and that's what we have to do. And I think that's what your campaign actually is and represents for the country, is exactly that type of voice. If it's a lone voice of one person, doesn't matter. It won't be for long. It'll become bigger. And it isn't the lone voice of one person in your case, for sure, because of what we've done there in the past. But that kind of approach to organizing is, I think, how we have to go at it. You got to talk to everybody. You've got to try to convince everybody. You've got to spend infinite amounts of time with everybody, while fully understanding that 99.9% of people are not going to respond today. If you get 0.1%, that's good, because that 0.1% is the key to moving the other 99.9%, who will have heard what you said and will say, and then when things get really hot, they'll say, where are those crazy LaRouche people again? I agreed with them all along. Right? That's how organizing actually works. So I think that we have grounds to be profoundly pessimistic about what surrounds us, about what is, but grounds to be profoundly optimistic about what ought to be, i.e. what we're going to create.
It's excellent. I know we've been going for a little while here, but we do definitely have some good questions coming in. So I want to, at least, if it's okay with you, at least get to, we got one online question. I know Detroit has another question, and then one more online question. So we can at least maybe plan on those three. And if you got a really good question, send it in, and you better make it pretty excellent, and then we'll consider taking you in here. But you got some time to get something in. So this question just picks up on the whole theme of philosophy and the effect on people. This person says, on the internet today, there's a lot of quasi-intellectuals running around promoting Nietzsche and his ideas. Can you speak about his role as a proto-fascist or situate him for me historically? I ask this because it seems like the same thing that your organization, the LaRouche PAC, was fighting in the 1990s in connection with the Contract on America, which seems to be out in a new way in full force on YouTube. I have learned from many of your videos about the concept of the culture of pessimism, and I think it is very important for young people to know the truth about Nietzsche and what is so wrong about his philosophy.
Well, that would, to really cover that adequately would require another class or a couple of classes and so on and so forth. Let me just say one or two things about it, again, to try to connect it to what we've been discussing. I mean, the phrase which everyone is familiar with from Nietzsche is his saying, God is dead. Now, let's cut to the chase here. What does that really mean? What he's saying is truth is dead, right? That there is no such thing as a universal principle, especially not one knowable to man, and therefore it's a Hobbesian world of war of one against all. And of course, everybody knows the humorous rejoinder to that is, Nietzsche may have said God is dead. After a little while, God said Nietzsche is dead. But that doesn't really get to the heart of the matter, which is this idea of what's behind the concept of God being dead. This is not a religious question. It's a theological question. It's a philosophical question. What Nietzsche was saying is the same thing as the Frankfurt School. And that's why Nietzsche is one of the philosophers of fascist movements all along, from Hitler up through the Frankfurt School and so on and so forth, because of the concept of man that he presents summarized in that single statement, right? Which is this idea that there is nothing beyond man's immediate personal existence. There's no morality greater than the so-called morality that comes from one trying to satisfy one's own life. And you get with Nietzsche and with Heidegger and so on and so forth, these are the direct predecessors of the Frankfurt School, which Helga discussed in the first class, Adorno and so on, who are these guys who came up with this whole theory of the authoritarian personality to justify an attack on any truth seeker. That anyone who dares to say, not I have the truth, but even to say, hey, why don't we try to find the truth? They say, you can't say that. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. Satan is entitled to his opinion, isn't he? What right do you have to tell people what the truth is? There is no such thing as truth to be pursued, let alone someone who says, hey, I think I found something, which is a universal principle, whether in physics or economics or music or what have you. So that the thing about Heidegger, the thing about Nietzsche and so on, is that it's, in effect, when you cut down to the actual underlying assumptions of the approach, it's identical to Hume and Bentham and rewarmed British empiricism. And all of that ultimately goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle was a fascist. I mean, he was simply a fascist before any fascist movement of the sort we know in modern times was created. But his outlook, as it just in that one single quote that I read you, that's straight fascism. That view of man is absolutely fascist. So tell people, especially in a philosophy department, that Aristotle is a fascist and they really ought to study Plato, and you've got a fist fight on your hands. And hopefully a good intellectual discussion is too. That causes almost as much commotion as going into the physics department and saying Newton was a fraud, which is, of course, what LaRouche has written about for 40, 50 years at least. We once ran a campaign in Mexico, because I'm involved in our Ibero-American work, as some of you are aware. And our campaign was to go to the physics departments of all the major university campuses in Mexico City with a big banner saying, Newton is a fraud, come to our forum to find out why. And believe me, we never had better political discussions than when we attacked Newton in the physics department. So.
Great. So let's go back to Detroit. I think we got another question there. We'll get you unmuted in just 1 second. Great.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, Dennis, I have to admit, after my initial irritation at being told I had to read David Hume, I actually realized how important it was in terms of an element of the organizing. And because we have a layer of the population today which has broken free from the enemy's narrative in terms of political issues. I mean, these are the people who voted for Trump, who carried out this beginning political realignment here in the United States. But they haven't broken free of the enemy's methodology, as you've described it. And it occurred to me in the following way, that you have discussions with people who know there's a conspiracy. They've got some idea that there's a bad force out there doing things, whatever name or label they put to it. But then their methodology is what I call internet connectos. That is, they go together and they piece conspiracies together based on this fact or that fact, or like taking your 3 asterisks there and, just coming up randomly with what is the connection between those 3 asterisks without ever thinking about the question of cause and effect. The difference between us as conspiracy theorists is that we start from the actual principles of a fight, of a principle of man in the image of the creator versus man as an animal. Most of these other very well-meaning people just have absolutely no grasp in terms of what is an actual conspiracy as opposed to an infinite number of internet connectos. So, I think this question of, I was frankly shocked reading Hume in terms of how explicit it was, that you can't know cause and effect. You can't know the future. You can't know any principles. Is really critical for taking this layer of the population, which is well-meaning and in motion, but is completely impotent at this point in terms of affecting anything, and especially in terms of organizing anybody else. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, as you were beginning to talk about this, I was actually looking down at the laptop here to see if I could pull up quickly the 3 dots, because that's what I was going to say, the red dots. So I'm glad you mentioned that. No, it's okay. She made the point. Okay. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. There is no way of knowing whether what's generating those 3 points is a circle, an ellipse, a drunk driver, or nothing. Just 3 points. That's so the reason I hate Hume so much, and I really hate Hume with a passion, is because he is so explicit and because he argues, and I'll be coming back to this in the discussion in the next, the next round discussion next week, is his argument that the only you cannot possibly establish the connection between anything and anything, except by taking recourse to custom or habit. Custom or habit. He says it's completely invalid. You can't prove that it exists, but hey, what the hell? It's just an idea. Who cares about ideas anyway? And I find this just completely revolting and disgusting. So I wanted to try to induce in a number of you that same revulsion and hatred, because this really does have to be rejected. It's evil. It's the foundation of all evil, in point of fact. Not just Hume. I mean, there's plenty of other people, but I find Hume particularly illustrative. I think the example that you mentioned of internet connectodots and so on is very useful, because I mean, this points to our overall organizing approach, and going back to some of the earlier questions. What the LaRouche movement has always done has been able to not just pull together in one room, to actually sit together in one room, people who, in our absence, would probably start a barroom brawl with each other, who think that they have completely antithetical, opposed views, and they may well on particular issues, and would probably get into a total John Wayne type fist fight over whether those three dots are actually a circle, an ellipse, or a drunk driver, or whatever, and they would kill each other over that, over different false interpretation of supposed facts. Or, to be a little more reasonable, how do you actually get Israelis and Arabs or Palestinians to sit down in the same room and come to a useful conclusion about what they're going to do? What do you do about the problems today of Islam and Christianity? How do you deal with this? And what LaRouche has always been able to do is to go at this from the standpoint of a higher principle, but a higher principle which emphatically and explicitly rejects the premises of everybody else's ideas. I mean, LaRouche has a way of saying it in the most devastating way, which is totally charming and disarming at the same time, when he says, look, you're just completely wrong. I mean, your neighbor is really wrong too, right? He's talked more about people's neighbors than I can ever recall. But that's what it is. The idea is to tell people that they're thinking wrong, and they're going to kill each other off unless they start thinking right. And thinking right means going at this from a higher standpoint. Look, in the United States, it's true. We have this process underway, which Lynn has stated this numerous times. This is an international process. It is not a U.S. national process. This is not internet connecto of dots based in the United States, nor internationally, but there's an international dynamic process going on, which included the Brexit vote. It included what happened here in the elections. And there's a global mass strike process of people saying, that's it, we've had it with globalization. We've had it with free trade. And they don't know why, they don't even know what it is, but they know that this doesn't work. And so there is a real major change going on, a real very rich political process underway, but it's not based on what people think or what they say they think. It's based on what's put them into motion, even without their knowing what put them into motion. And there's no reason in the world we can't, in the United States, do what nobody else can do, which is get people together, not just from opposite sides of the aisle, as we've always done, but from coming from different standpoints, different perspectives, people who thought they couldn't possibly even sit down and talk to each other, let alone actually come up with a common solution that works. And when people sit down with LaRouche, that happens. It's an incredible transformation that occurs. What it is, it's Couza's method of the coincidence of opposites, of coincidentia oppositorum, which Helga talks about so much. And this is not just a philosophical idea. It's the idea, as she has always explained, that you have to come up with a higher level proposal or concept which solves the real problem that both parties, or all 26 parties, has brought them to the table. And that's what you have to do. I mean, my experience with this in Argentina, there's a joke in Argentina. You get 5 Peronists in a room and you've got 6 factions. And so how did we organize in Argentina? Well, what LaRouche told us to do is go in above the factions. You got to go in and absolutely don't get involved with the faction fights, because they're all wrong. because the starting point is wrong. And Kuza really had this right. And we're facing problems today, like with this culture of death, the stuff that Keisha was talking about just a moment. There's a really serious problem here. How do we go at it? I think the way we have to go at it is the way Kuza discusses in the opening couple of sentences on the Piece of Faith, the Pace Fidei of 1453. Now, just suspend for a moment your judgment on the specifics of what he's talking about, and think about what's happening in this country, in this world today. He says, news of the atrocities which have recently been perpetrated by the Turkish king in Constantinople and have now been divulged has so inflamed a man who once saw that region with zeal for God that amongst many sighs he asked the Creator of all things if in his kindness he might moderate the persecution which raged more than usual on account of diverse religious rites. And then he goes on and he said that this led him, after much thinking and contemplation and prayer, that we have to find a unique and propitious concordance, and through this to constitute a perpetual peace in religion upon the appropriate and true course. And that's what organizing it is. You have to find a unique and propitious concordance, which is never located in any of the explanations which people give, as in the internet connector that you're talking about. So that's why I wanted people to have a look at, or have another look at if they looked at it before, Hume, to just get an idea of how really satanic and inhuman this is, how systematic it is, and how wrong it is, and that there is an actual scientific approach that works. It just takes a lot of thinking to figure it out and to act and organize around it.
We got we've got a few other questions, but I think we're just going to end it with the one that Diane sent us here, which I mean, we've covered a lot. Some of this has been touched on already, but I think this will be a good concluding point. Diane says, it seems to me that Bertrand Russell took it beyond the worst, and that we are now at the point where, quote unquote, popular opinion has even rejected sense perception, but people choose to believe in things that are demonstrably false. The world is actually flat. Human beings cause climate change. Who's actually experienced that, really, etc. I might add myself that Russia is the only reason that Hillary Clinton lost the election. It's a hell of a narrative to believe. She goes on, I think that the social media I think that social media as thought control has played a devastating role, as well as the so-called educational system, to bringing us a long way towards what Russell pushed for with the belief that snow is black. I think that having an actually productive economy where people have to act upon nature and change it would greatly help, as well as improvements in classical music, participating as either an audience or a performer. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, let me read what Lyndon LaRouche said about Bertrand Russell, and then I'll go on to address some of the other things that you're talking about here. He said, this is in How Bertrand Russell Became an Evil Man. He said, Britain's Lord Bertrand Russell has been, beyond any reasonable doubt, the most evil public figure of the passing century. There is nothing essential in Russell which is not repetition of what had been written by the founder of the British Foreign Intelligence Service, Jeremy Bentham, now more than 200 years ago. So I get your point about how crazy people have gotten today, and there's no question about that. But, it really is based on sense perception, because sense perception is not based on any facts or evidence either. I mean, the earth is flat. Of course the earth is flat. Just look around you. It's obviously true. Global warming? It's obviously the case. I was just in the sauna. So it's and then look at this drug question. I mean, let's get a little more serious about the problem here, because there's many problems with drugs, many problems with drugs, including the question of addiction per se, the physical aspects of what it does, the fact that all drugs, starting with marijuana, produce impotence, physical as well as psychosexual impotence, and that's a proven fact. So if you don't think that's the case, you better rethink that carefully. But I think that what is most damaging about drugs is what I was describing earlier, which is that it is a way of intentionally producing out of unity cacophony. In other words, the intention is to take even the simplest perceptions of objects and deal with it like a kaleidoscope does, right? No one here is so old that they haven't once played with a kaleidoscope, right? Do they have kaleidoscopes today? Kids who use kaleidoscopes?
I mean, there are antique shops.
They're antique shops. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. I guess you don't have to have a kaleidoscope, a physical kaleidoscope. You can probably just get an app, download an app which produces a kaleidoscope on your iPhone or.
I have seen one in real life.
You've seen a real life one.
Yeah.
I'm relieved. What does a kaleidoscope do? It deliberately shatters your perception or it reduces your mental activity to a perceptual field of nothing but that, of sense perception. And that's what drugs does. The most innocent of drugs do that intentionally. In other words, it takes man's ability to actually generate, forget higher level creativity and so on, simple formation of unified perception of objects like this red pen. You take drugs, you don't see a red pen. Wow, groovy, cool. That's not what you see. You see a kaleidoscope. And it's very, very evil. It's not, it's not a joke. I mean, I'm saying it like a joke. It's not a joke because it produces that irreversibly. You can always, through behaviorism and this sort of stuff, you can always get men to act like chimpanzees or animals. B.F. Skinner proved that. You can get human beings to act like pigeons. That's all that behaviorist psychology is. But you cannot get a pigeon to act like a human being because there is a higher level cognitive function, and drugs are intended deliberately to bestialize people in precisely that way. It's intended to take what is harmonic and make it cacophony. And part of what we have to do, I think, in organizing in this totally insane, crazy world, and I'm not disagreeing that the world is a lot crazier than it used to be, but I think there's a straight line of consistency between Jean-Marie Ortiz and Bentham and Lord Shelburne and the French Revolution to Bertrand Russell. And in fact, Russell, like Lynn says, has just rewarmed Bentham. But what we need to do is we have to produce, in effect, exactly the inverse of this, what drugs do. We have to produce harmony out of cacophony. We have to take what is, for most people, incomprehensible, unintelligible, even in their daily existence, but especially the world around them, and to provide them with the tools to understand it, which come from changing it. Let me repeat that. The tools for understanding something come from acting to change it. It does not come from, as I was saying earlier, to contemplate it. And if you contemplate it long enough, then you'll somehow understand it. That may well work for navel contemplation if you really want to find out how much belly button lint you have. But it does not work in terms of real knowledge. Real knowledge is based on the unity that comes from transforming the world around you. And I think that the work that we're doing with our choruses, for example, just like with our political campaigns, this is what but coincidentio oppositorum. What is the chorus work other than taking a whole bunch of individual voices and actually producing a unified approach to developing a higher level concept? And people's identity changes in that process because they think not as a zero-sum game, it's me against all the other voices. There are people in some choruses, right? Oh yeah, I'll sing louder than you. Of course, that's, It's hard to sing louder than a bunch of sopranos sometimes, but altos have some difficulty with that. But the mindset that I'm talking about, in actual scientific work in a chorus, that's not what you're doing. You're transformed because you're trying to produce something very different than what you individually could do. It comes from engaging with and transforming yourself and being transformed by a social process. That's what political organizing is. That's what education is. That's what this discussion is that we're having here today, and this whole class series is all about. And that is the very essence and nature of the human species. That's what we are. We are not individuals cast about, thrown into nothingness, as the existentialists would have us believe. We're not in a war of each against all, as Hobbes would argue. This is not a zero-sum game in which if I don't move fast, I'm going to be the last one left out of the musical chairs. Life is not lifeboat ethics. Great for that occasion. If you ever get caught at sea, you'll be glad you took that economics class. But otherwise, forget it. It's a lie. That's not what life is. That's not what human beings are. And increasingly, that's not what the planet is becoming, because we have a process underway. And I would argue that what's going on in China today, and what just happened with Russia, and the Russians and the Chinese are working very closely together. There's a reason that Putin said that their primary goal in the country is to alleviate poverty. There's a reason he said that. And there's a reason Putin was standing next to Xi Jinping at their military parade and vice versa. These are not separate things. But I would argue that that process and that dynamic is of a piece with what happened in the elections in the United States, with the election of Trump, what happened in Brexit, and so on and so forth. So we can look with optimism to what is happening in the majority of the planet, where the World Land Bridge is moving forward, where the new Silk Road spirit is catching on, and look at that with optimism and understanding that the process that we are part of creating in the United States is part and parcel of exactly that same process. And that we are fortunate enough to have access to great thinkers before us, Coué and Leibniz, and most especially Lyndon LaRouche, on whose shoulders we can stand to try to understand enough to transform people. And the emotion associated with that is love. That's creativity. And the emotion associated with the zero-sum game and geopolitics is satanic bestiality and hatred. And those are the options. If we can make that clear to everybody as we organize, and we awaken that spark of actual humanity in people, we can be confident that enough people, starting with just a few, will choose true humanity over bestiality. And that's how we can win.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
My pleasure.
This was a lot of fun. I think we covered a lot. I think for our viewers, I think we certainly are getting into the deeper ideas about what we mean by a new paradigm. So I think this is a very important class series and process of discussion that we've initiated here, and we're taking the first steps and getting more in depth into the entire shift that we really are talking about and have to create and is available to us right now. So I think this is good. We definitely look forward to our next discussion with you, which will be next week, which if you haven't got the memo yet, the next week will be for registered participants only. So if you're not registered, you're not going to be able to participate in the discussion at all. Last week we did have a very active and productive discussion with Harley in follow-up to his class the week prior. And I would just like to thank the people that sent in homework and took the time to write out their thoughts. It was very useful to see where different people are at, what ideas are out there, what assumptions and beliefs people are fighting with out in the general population as we all work to make this shift in the United States and globally right now. So the whole dialogue process we thought was very good, and we look forward to that next week with Dennis. So again, if you haven't registered, register. You'll get an email with the homework assignments, the questions that Dennis has provided which go directly to what he discussed today and the reading material. And then we'll be able to take that up with you much more directly and in person next week in our follow-up discussion. So I think with that, we'd like to thank Houston for getting on with us again. It's always a pleasure. And we'd like to thank Detroit for getting on with us again. And we enjoyed the discussion today and all of our online participants. And we look forward to continuing the work and progressing in this fight. So thank you.